What happens when your best friend is also the most powerful person in the country? How do you end a relationship with someone who can sign your death warrant? Can you love someone who holds absolute power over you? And what happens when that love sours? These are not just questions from a prestige drama. They were the reality for queens and their chosen companions for centuries. Their breakups were not just personal heartaches. They were political earthquakes that could topple governments, start wars, and change the course of history. Forget quiet unfriendings or ghosting. Royal breakups were public, messy, and often final. Number 16, can you be fired by a king and still win at life? Anne of Cleves was rejected by her husband after just 6 months of marriage. King Henry VIII claimed he was deceived by her portrait, finding her unattractive in person. The marriage was never consummated, a fact Henry made sure the entire world knew. He nicknamed her the Flanders Mare. Despite this public humiliation, she outlived all of Henry's other wives and died a wealthy, independent woman in England. The story of Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII is often told as a joke. It is the story of a king who basically ordered a bride online and was disappointed with what he got. But from Anne's perspective, it was a terrifying ordeal that she navigated with incredible skill. She was a German princess brought to England in 1540 to be the fourth wife of a notoriously difficult and dangerous king. The match was political. It was meant to create an alliance between England and the German Protestant states. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, pushed for the marriage. The famous portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger was sent to Henry to show him his future bride. And Henry liked what he saw. He approved the match. The first meeting was a disaster. Henry, in a romantic but foolish mood, decided to surprise Anne. He burst into her rooms at Rochester, disguised as a common messenger. Anne, who spoke no English and had been raised in a formal, sheltered court, did not recognize him. She was polite but unimpressed. She went back to watching the bear baiting outside her window. Henry's ego was crushed. He had expected her to be instantly smitten. He decided right then that he did not like her. He complained to his courtiers that she was nothing like her portrait. He found her plain. He said she had unpleasant body odors. The wedding went ahead. Henry could not back out without causing a major international incident. But he was miserable. The wedding night was a failure. Henry publicly declared that he could not consummate the marriage. He told his doctors and ministers intimate details, claiming her body was not as it should be. It was a deeply humiliating situation for Anne. She was a young woman in a foreign country, married to the most powerful man in the land, and he was telling everyone she was undesirable. But Anne played her part perfectly. She remained calm and dignified. She apparently told her ladies in waiting that the king was very kind, kissing her good night and good morning. She seemed to not understand what a consummated marriage required. The political winds shifted quickly. The alliance with the German states was no longer necessary. Henry had his eye on a new woman, the young and vivacious Catherine Howard. He needed a way out of his marriage to Anne. This was a dangerous time for a Queen of England. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was cast aside after a long and painful struggle. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was executed. Anyone would have been terrified, but Anne of Cleves was smart. When Henry's ministers came to her with a proposal for an annulment, she did not fight. She did not argue. She did not insist on her rights as queen. She agreed. She testified that the marriage was unconsummated. She was cooperative and sensible. Her cooperation saved her life and secured her future. Henry was so relieved and grateful that he gave her a generous settlement. She was declared the king's beloved sister. She received several properties, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn's family. She was given a prominent position at court, senior to all women in England, except the king's own wife and daughters. She was a wealthy, independent woman. She was free. She had escaped a marriage to a tyrant and had come out on top. She stayed in England, enjoying a comfortable life. She had a good relationship with Henry's children, especially the future Queen Elizabeth I, while Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, met a tragic end. Anne of Cleves was living a peaceful life in the English countryside. She had turned a royal rejection, a public humiliation, into a personal victory. She had lost a king but gained her freedom. It was one of the smartest breakups in royal history. Number 15. What if your public divorce became a national scandal? Queen Caroline of Brunswick and King George IV had one of the most toxic relationships in royal history. They hated each other from the moment they met. He tried to divorce her by putting her on public trial for adultery, a move that backfired spectacularly. When she was barred from attending their own coronation, she hammered on the doors of Westminster Abbey, demanding to be let in, while crowds outside cheered for her. Her estranged husband was so unpopular, people saw supporting her as a way to oppose him. Their story began in 1795. George, then Prince of Wales, was a man of huge appetites and even bigger debts. His father, King George III, agreed to pay them off on one condition: George had to marry a suitable German princess, Caroline of Brunswick. George already had a secret illegal wife, Maria Fitzherbert, whom he adored, but he needed the money. So he agreed. He did not handle it well. When he first met Caroline, he was so appalled by her appearance and lack of hygiene that he turned to his courtier and said, "I am not well, pray get me a glass of brandy." He spent most of his wedding day drunk. He allegedly spent his wedding night passed out in the fireplace grate. Somehow a child was conceived. Princess Charlotte was born 9 months later. After her birth, George and Caroline separated. They lived apart for the next 2 decades. Caroline moved to a villa in Blackheath, London, where she lived a bohemian and unconventional life. She was loud, flamboyant, and defied royal protocol. George, meanwhile, continued his extravagant lifestyle with a series of mistresses. He was desperate to be rid of Caroline. He launched an investigation into her private life, hoping to find evidence of an affair that would grant him a divorce. This was known as the Delicate Investigation of 1806. It found no conclusive proof, but it sullied her name. Fed up with the constant scrutiny, Caroline left England in 1814 and began traveling around Europe and the Mediterranean. Her lifestyle became even more eccentric. She hired a handsome Italian servant named Bartolomeo Pergami and promoted him to be the head of her household. Rumors swirled that they were lovers. George saw his chance. When his father, King George III, died in 1820, George became King George IV. Caroline, by law, was now Queen of Great Britain. George was horrified. He refused to recognize her as queen and had her name removed from the Church of England's liturgy. He offered her a huge sum of money to stay out of the country and renounce her title. Caroline refused. She decided to return to England to claim her rights. Her return was a sensation. The common people of England despised the new king. They saw him as a fat, selfish, decadent buffoon. Caroline, by contrast, became an unlikely, popular hero. They saw her as a wronged woman, a victim of a cruel husband. Huge crowds greeted her ship at Dover and followed her carriage to London. They chanted her name and rallied in her support. George was furious. He pressed his government to introduce a bill in Parliament, the Pains and Penalties Bill 1820. Its goal was to dissolve the marriage and strip Caroline of the title of queen on the grounds of adultery with Pergami. This led to a sensational public trial in the House of Lords. For weeks, the nation was gripped by the sordid details of Caroline's life abroad. And Italian servants were brought over to testify against her. They told stories of her bathing in front of Pergami and sleeping in a tent with him on the deck of a ship. Caroline's defense team, led by the brilliant lawyer Henry Brougham, tore the witnesses' testimony apart. They also made thinly veiled threats to expose the king's own numerous affairs, including his secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. The trial was a disaster for the king. The public was firmly on Caroline's side. The government realized the bill would never pass the House of Commons and withdrew it. London erupted in celebration for days. Caroline had won. But it was a hollow victory. The king still refused to accept her. The following year, in 1821, was the coronation. Caroline was determined to be crowned alongside her husband. She arrived at Westminster Abbey, but the doors were closed to her. She went from door to door demanding entry, but was turned away at each one by armed guards. It was a final public humiliation. Her spirit was broken. Just a few weeks later, she fell ill and died. Her breakup with George was not a quiet separation. It was a brutal public war that she technically won, but at the cost of her own peace and, ultimately, her life. Number 14, can a friendship survive the pressures of a revolution? Marie Antoinette and the Duchesse de Polignac were inseparable. The queen showered her friend with lavish gifts, titles, and royal apartments at Versailles. The Duchess's family received an estimated 400,000 livres a year in salaries and pensions. But when the French Revolution began, the public saw the Duchess as a greedy parasite who was bankrupting the nation. Fearing for her life, she fled France, leaving the queen to face the storm alone. The queen felt abandoned. Yolande de Polastron, the Duchesse de Polignac, first met Marie Antoinette in 1775 at a formal ball at Versailles. The queen was instantly charmed by her natural, easygoing manner. Unlike the stiff and formal courtiers who surrounded the queen, Yolande was refreshingly relaxed. Marie Antoinette was tired of the rigid etiquette of the French court. She longed for genuine friendship and a more private, informal life. Yolande and her circle of friends provided that escape. The queen soon made her a central figure in her private society at the Petit Trianon, her personal retreat on the grounds of Versailles. Their friendship was incredibly close. The queen doted on Yolande. She appointed her governess to the children of France, one of the most prestigious positions at court. This gave Yolande immense influence and direct access to the royal family. The queen also showered the Polignac family with money and favors. They were granted estates, titles, and lucrative pensions. This generosity, however, caused enormous resentment. Other nobles at court were jealous of the Polignacs' influence. More dangerously, the public began to see the Duchess as a symbol of the queen's extravagance and poor judgment. The pamphlets and cartoons depicted her as a greedy schemer who was manipulating a foolish queen and draining the royal treasury while the people of France starved. The bond between the two women was genuine, at least at first. But the power imbalance was huge. Marie Antoinette was the queen. Yolande was her subject. The friendship was built on the queen's favor, and that favor was dependent on the queen's happiness. As political and financial crises mounted in France in the 1780s, the queen's popularity plummeted. Her friendship with the Duchesse de Polignac became a major liability. The Duchesse was blamed for everything from the queen's frivolous spending to the nation's massive debt. The breaking point came in July 1789. On July 14th, the Bastille was stormed. The French Revolution had begun. The situation at Versailles became incredibly dangerous. The names of the queen's favorites, especially the Duchesse de Polignac, were on prescription lists circulating in Paris. People were calling for their heads. On the night of July 16th, after a tearful farewell, the king and queen convinced the Polignac family that they had to flee for their own safety. The Duchesse, disguised as a common traveler, escaped from Versailles with her family and made her way to Switzerland. For Marie Antoinette, this was a devastating blow. She felt utterly alone. While she understood the necessity of her friend's departure, a part of her felt abandoned. In the dangerous and terrifying months and years that followed, she was surrounded by enemies. The one person she had trusted and confided in was gone. They corresponded through letters. The letters showed their affection, but also the chasm that had opened between them. The Duchesse wrote of her concern for the queen. The queen wrote of her fear and isolation. The Duchesse encouraged the queen to escape, but from the safety of exile, she could not fully grasp the reality of the queen's situation as a virtual prisoner. Their friendship, once the source of so much joy for the queen, had ended in a painful separation dictated by political terror. The Duchesse died in Vienna in 1793, just a few months after Marie Antoinette was executed in Paris, and their relationship, which had started as a private escape, ended as a public tragedy, a casualty of a revolution that neither of them could control. Number 13, what happens when your spiritual advisor destroys your empire? Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia believed Grigori Rasputin was a holy man sent by God to heal her hemophiliac son Alexei. Her faith in him was absolute. She allowed him unprecedented influence over political appointments even during World War I. This relationship convinced the Russian public and the aristocracy that their empress was either a fool or a traitor, controlled by a demonic peasant. This belief directly contributed to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. Alexandra was a German princess, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was a deeply religious and shy woman who married Tsar Nicholas II for love. Her life was dominated by a single terrible fear: the health of her son and heir, Alexei. Alexei had inherited hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A simple bump or scrape could lead to a life-threatening bleed. The doctors could do nothing. Alexandra lived in a state of constant anxiety. She turned to religion and mysticism, desperately searching for a miracle. In 1905, she was introduced to Grigori Rasputin. He was a Siberian peasant, a wandering mystic with a reputation as a healer and a man of God. He was also a notorious drunkard and womanizer. But when he met the royal family, he was on his best behavior. And he seemed to have a miraculous effect on Alexei. On several occasions, when Alexei was suffering from a severe bleeding episode and the doctors had given up hope, Rasputin would arrive. He would sit by the boy's bed, talk to him, and pray, and the bleeding would stop. Historians and doctors have various theories for this. Perhaps his calm presence soothed the boy, lowering his blood pressure. Perhaps he used a form of hypnotism. Or perhaps he simply insisted that the doctors stop administering aspirin, which was a common painkiller at the time, but is also a blood thinner. To Alexandra, the explanation was simple. Rasputin was a holy man, a saint. Her devotion to him became absolute. She called him our friend. His word was law. Nicholas II was a weak-willed ruler, and he adored his wife. He often deferred to her judgment. And her judgment was increasingly influenced by Rasputin. This was a disaster for Russia. When Nicholas II went to the front to command the army during World War I in 1915, he left Alexandra in charge of the government at home. This effectively meant Rasputin was running the country. He began to meddle in state affairs. He would recommend his cronies for positions as government ministers. Competent officials were dismissed and replaced by incompetent ones who had Rasputin's favor. The government descended into chaos. The war effort was hampered. The Russian people were starving, and the army was suffering catastrophic losses. Rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered that Alexandra, being German-born, was a spy. They said that she and Rasputin were lovers and were deliberately sabotaging Russia to help Germany win the war. These rumors were almost certainly false, but they were widely believed. The relationship between the Empress and the mad monk became a national obsession. It destroyed the last shred of credibility the monarchy had. The aristocracy was horrified. They saw that Rasputin was leading the country to ruin. In December 1916, a group of conservative nobles, including the Tsar's own cousin, decided to take matters into their own hands. They lured Rasputin to a palace, poisoned him with cyanide-laced cakes and wine, shot him multiple times, and then dumped his body into the icy Neva River. When Alexandra heard the news of his death, she was devastated. She saw it as a sign of the coming apocalypse. She had lost her savior. In a way, she was right. Rasputin's death did not save the monarchy. It was too late. The damage was done just a few months later. In March 1917, the Russian Revolution began. The people had lost all faith in their rulers. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, was over. Alexandra's unbreakable faith in one man, her refusal to see him for what he was not just a personal failing. It was a political catastrophe that helped to plunge her country into revolution and civil war. Her relationship with Rasputin was a breakup that was not between two people, but between a ruling family and its entire nation. Number 12. When does a patron decide her explorer has gone too far? Queen Isabella I of Castile sponsored Christopher Columbus on his voyage across the Atlantic in 1492. His discovery of the Americas made Spain the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe. But Isabella, a devout Catholic, became increasingly disturbed by Columbus's brutal treatment and enslavement of the native peoples. She ordered many of the enslaved people he sent back to Spain to be freed and returned. Their relationship soured as her moral objections clashed with his quest for gold and glory. Isabella was a shrewd and powerful ruler. Along with her husband, King Ferdinand of Aragon, she united Spain, completed the Reconquista by capturing Granada from the Moors, and established the Spanish Inquisition. She was deeply religious, but also pragmatic. When Christopher Columbus, a determined Genoese navigator, came to her with his radical idea to sail west to reach the East Indies, most experts thought he was crazy. They believed the world was much larger than Columbus calculated, and that his ships would run out of supplies long before reaching Asia. For years, Columbus petitioned the courts of Europe for funding without success. Isabella's court rejected him several times. But Columbus was persistent. Finally, after the successful conquest of Granada, Isabella agreed to fund his expedition. Her motivations were mixed. She saw the potential for great wealth from the spice trade. She also saw it as an opportunity to spread Christianity to new lands. It was a gamble, but one she was willing to take. In August 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 small ships. When he returned the following year, claiming to have found islands off the coast of Asia, he was hailed as a hero. He brought back gold, exotic plants, and a small number of indigenous people whom he presented at court. Isabella was pleased. She and Ferdinand granted Columbus the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea and appointed him governor of the new territories. But on his subsequent voyages, a darker picture began to emerge. Columbus was a brilliant navigator, but a terrible governor. He and his men were brutal in their treatment of the native Taino people of the Caribbean. They were driven by a rapacious hunger for gold. Those who could not provide the impossible quotas of gold had their hands cut off. The Spanish colonists under his command were unruly and violent. They committed horrific atrocities against the local population. Columbus also began a transatlantic slave trade, capturing hundreds of indigenous people and shipping them back to Spain to be sold. This was a step too far for Queen Isabella. She viewed the native peoples as future subjects of the Spanish crown and potential converts to Christianity. In her eyes, they were not to be enslaved. They were to be protected and educated in the Catholic faith. In 1495, when a shipment of enslaved people arrived from Columbus, she ordered an investigation into the legality of their enslavement. In 1500, she explicitly ordered that all the native people who had been brought to Spain as slaves be freed and returned to their homes at the government's expense. She declared that the Indians were her subjects and could not be enslaved. Her relationship with Columbus deteriorated rapidly. Reports of his tyrannical and incompetent governorship of the colony of Hispaniola flooded back to Spain. Colonists complained of his cruelty. Royal officials sent to investigate were horrified by the chaos and brutality they found. In 1500, Isabella and Ferdinand had Columbus arrested and brought back to Spain in chains. He was stripped of his title as governor. Although he was later pardoned and allowed to make one final voyage, he never regained his former power or the Queen's trust. The Queen who had made his dreams possible had turned against him. Her religious and moral convictions clashed irreconcilably with his methods. Isabella died in 1504. In her will, she included a clause instructing her heirs to ensure the fair treatment of the indigenous peoples of the new... it was a final posthumous rebuke to the man she had sponsored. Theirs was a professional breakup born not of personal animosity, but of a fundamental disagreement over the very soul of the new empire they had created together. Number 11, can you execute a man in your own home and keep your crown? Queen Christina of Sweden was one of the most brilliant and unconventional monarchs of the 17th century. After abdicating her throne, she moved to Rome and established her own court. Her favorite and master of horse, the Marchese Gian Rinaldo Monaldeschi, betrayed her trust by passing her private correspondence to her enemies. In 1657, Christina took justice into her own hands. She had him tried and executed by her own guards inside the Fontainebleau Palace in France, a shocking act that horrified all of Europe and tarnished her reputation forever. Christina was a fascinating figure, the only child of the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus. She became Queen of Sweden at the age of 6. She was raised like a prince, receiving a rigorous education in philosophy, science, and languages. She was a brilliant intellectual and a patron of the arts. But she hated the duties of a monarch. She refused to marry, famously declaring she was not made for it. In 1654, at the age of 27, she did the unthinkable. She abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and left Sweden for a life of freedom in Rome. In Rome, she became a major figure in the cultural life of the city. She surrounded herself with artists, writers, and thinkers. One of the key members of her traveling court was the Italian nobleman, the Marchese Monaldeschi. He was her confidant, her advisor, and her master of horse. She trusted him completely, but Monaldeschi was playing a double game. Christina was engaged in sensitive political negotiations, hoping to become the Queen of Naples. Monaldeschi, for reasons that are still debated, betrayed her. He copied her private letters and passed them on to her rivals, sabotaging her plans. Christina discovered the betrayal. She was in France at the time, staying as a guest of King Louis XIV at the Palace of Fontainebleau. And she was a queen without a kingdom, but she still believed she possessed the absolute authority of a monarch. She decided to act as judge, jury, and executioner. She confronted Monaldeschi in a gallery of the palace. She showed him the evidence of his treason, the copies of her letters in his own handwriting. He broke down, confessed, and begged for his life. Christina was unmoved. She told him to prepare for death. She sent for a priest from the town to hear his final confession. Then she ordered her personal guards to execute him on the spot. The execution was a brutal and messy affair. Monaldeschi was wearing a coat of mail under his clothes, and the guards' swords could not easily pierce it. The killing took a long time. It happened right there in the palace of the King of France. The French court was absolutely scandalized. This was a shocking breach of hospitality and sovereignty. Christina had carried out a private execution in a royal residence that was not her own. She had acted as if her royal authority was absolute, even in exile. The French government was furious, but they did not know what to do. Christina was still a former queen and a guest. They couldn't exactly arrest her. King Louis XIV's chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, told her that she would have been punished for such an act if she were not who she was. Christina was unrepentant. She argued that she was a queen, responsible only to God, and that Monaldeschi was a traitor who deserved his fate. She believed she had every right to dispense justice to a member of her own court. The incident destroyed her reputation across Europe. She was seen as a barbarian, a cruel and vengeful woman. Her political ambitions were finished. No one would trust her after this. She eventually returned to Rome, where she lived out the rest of her life as a patron of the arts, but the shadow of Fontainebleau never left her. The breakup with Monaldeschi was the most extreme imaginable. It was a relationship that ended not with a quiet word or a slammed door, but with a drawn sword in a royal gallery. It showed the world the formidable and terrifying side of a queen who refused to let anyone, even another king, tell her what she could or could not do. Number 10, how does a queen dispose of a favorite when she is 80 years old? Empress Wu Zetian was the only woman to ever rule China in her own right. She was a brilliant and ruthless politician who held power for decades. In her old age, she became infatuated with two handsome young brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong. She gave them titles, wealth, and enormous influence at court. They became arrogant and corrupt. In 705, a group of her own officials, tired of the Zhang brothers' power, staged a palace coup. They forced the 80-year-old empress to abdicate and then executed her two young favorites. Wu Zetian's story is remarkable. She began her life at court as a concubine to Emperor Taizong. After his death, she became a concubine to his son, Emperor Gaozong, eventually becoming his empress consort. She was intelligent and politically gifted, and as the emperor's health failed, she became the de facto ruler of China. After his death, she ruled through her sons, and then in 690 she took the final step. She declared herself empress regnant, establishing her own dynasty, the Zhou. She ruled as emperor for 15 years. She was a capable ruler, but she was also known for her ruthlessness in eliminating her rivals. As she entered her 70s, she began to rely on a small circle of trusted companions. Among them were the Zhang brothers. They were introduced to the empress in the late 690s. They were known for their good looks, charm, and musical talents. The empress, now an old woman, was captivated by them. She spent a great deal of time with them, and they became her constant companions. She showered them with honors. They were given high-ranking positions at court, made dukes, and given lavish residences. They effectively controlled access to the empress. Anyone who wanted to petition the empress or gain her favor had to go through the Zhang brothers. This created enormous resentment. The brothers were not skilled administrators or statesmen. They were simply the empress's favorites. They used their position to enrich themselves and their family. They were arrogant and openly corrupt. They accepted bribes and sold government offices. High-ranking officials and ministers were forced to humble themselves before these two young men. The court was filled with stories of their excesses. They built magnificent mansions and lived lives of incredible luxury, all funded by the state in their own corruption. They were a cancer at the heart of the court. The empress seemed blind to their faults, or perhaps in her old age, she simply did not care. She enjoyed their company and was unwilling to listen to any criticism of them. This created a dangerous situation. Her top ministers and generals saw the Zhang brothers as a threat to the stability of the state. They feared that after the empress's death, the brothers would try to seize power for themselves, plunging the country into civil war. By 705, the empress was over 80 years old and in failing health. Her ministers decided they had to act. A group of powerful officials, led by the Chancellor Zhang Jianji, planned a coup. They forged an order claiming that the Zhang brothers were plotting a rebellion. With a group of loyal soldiers, they stormed the palace. They went to the empress's private chambers and seized the two brothers. They were executed on the spot. The plotters then went to the empress. They showed her the heads of her favorites. They told her that they had acted to save the empire. The old empress was now powerless. She was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of her son Li Jian, who restored the Tang dynasty. Wu Zetian was given the respectful title of Empress Regnant Zetian de Sheng, but her reign was over. She died later that year. The relationship with the Zhang brothers was the final chapter of her long and extraordinary life. It was a relationship that exposed her one great vulnerability in old age, a weakness for flattery and companionship that allowed two corrupt young men to nearly derail the empire she had so masterfully controlled for half a century. Her ministers ended the relationship for her in the most brutal way possible. Number 9, can you make your ex-lover a king and then take his country? Catherine the Great of Russia and Stanislaw Poniatowski were young lovers in St. Petersburg long before she became empress. Years later, using her immense power, she had him elected King of Poland. She thought he would be a loyal puppet. But when he tried to act like a real king and reform his country, Catherine turned on him. She engineered the partitions of Poland, a series of annexations by Russia, Prussia, and Austria that wiped Poland off the map for over 120 years. He lost his crown and his country to the woman who had given them to him. Their story began in the 1750s. Catherine was then the Grand Duchess Ekaterina, the unhappy wife of the heir to the Russian throne, Peter. Stanislaw Poniatowski was a handsome, cultured Polish aristocrat sent to the Russian court as part of a diplomatic mission. They were both in their 20s. They fell deeply in love. It was a passionate affair that lasted for several years. And Catherine later wrote that he was the most lovable of all her lovers. But the relationship was cut short when Stanislaw was forced to leave Russia due to political intrigues. Years passed. In 1762, Catherine seized the Russian throne in a coup, becoming Catherine the Great. A year later, the King of Poland died. Catherine saw an opportunity. She decided to use her power to place her former lover, Stanislaw, on the Polish throne. Poland at this time was a weak and unstable kingdom, heavily influenced by its powerful neighbors, especially Russia. Catherine spent a huge amount of money and moved Russian troops into Poland to ensure Stanislaw's election. In 1764, he became King Stanislaw II Augustus of Poland. Catherine expected him to be her puppet. She wanted a weak Poland that she could control. But Stanislaw had other ideas. He was an enlightened man, a patron of the arts and sciences. He genuinely wanted to strengthen his country. He began a series of reforms aimed at modernizing Poland's government, economy, and army. He wanted to abolish the liberum veto, a disastrous parliamentary rule that allowed any single nobleman to block legislation, which had made the Polish government completely ineffective. And Catherine was alarmed. A strong, reformed Poland was not in Russia's interest. She began to actively undermine her former lover. She supported a confederation of conservative Polish nobles who opposed the king's reforms. This led to a brutal civil war in Poland. The breakup was now political. The personal affection they may have still felt for each other was irrelevant. Catherine the Empress had to act in the interests of the Russian Empire. King Stanislaw was now a political obstacle. In 1772, Catherine colluded with Prussia and Austria to carry out the first partition of Poland. The three powers simply annexed large chunks of Polish territory. Stanislaw was powerless to stop them. He was a king with a foreign army in his capital city. Over the next 2 decades, he continued to try to reform what was left of his country. His greatest achievement was the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, a remarkably progressive constitution that aimed to create a constitutional monarchy. This was the final straw for Catherine. A constitutional, potentially revolutionary Poland on her border was unacceptable. She saw it as a dangerous infection of French revolutionary ideas. In 1792, she sent the Russian army into Poland and crushed the new constitution. This led to the second partition of Poland in 1793, with Russia and Prussia taking even more land. Stanislaw was left with a tiny rump state. The Poles rose up in a final, desperate rebellion in 1794, but they were crushed by the overwhelming might of the Russian army. In 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria carried out the third and final partition. Poland ceased to exist as an independent state. Stanislaw was forced to abdicate. He spent the last years of his life as a virtual prisoner in St. Petersburg, living on a pension from the Empress who had first made him a king and then destroyed him. Their love affair had ended with the annihilation of his country. It was a breakup on a geopolitical scale, a stark lesson in what happens when personal feelings collide with the ruthless calculus of power. Number 8, can love survive a war and a revolution? Marie Antoinette and the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen shared a deep and passionate bond that lasted for 2 decades. He was a loyal and devoted friend, and most likely her lover. He was the one who masterminded the royal family's doomed flight to Varennes in 1791, a desperate attempt to escape revolutionary France. Their relationship ended with her imprisonment and execution, a tragic conclusion to a love story played out against the backdrop of one of history's most violent upheavals. Axel von Fersen was a handsome and aristocratic Swedish army officer. He first met Marie Antoinette in 1774 at a masked ball in Paris, shortly before she became queen. They were both young, and there was an immediate connection. Fersen became a regular at the French court and a member of the queen's inner circle. He was discreet, intelligent, and utterly devoted to her. While many courtiers sought to use the queen for their own advancement, Fersen seemed to want nothing from her but her company. Their relationship was the subject of intense gossip. It is almost certain that they were lovers, though their correspondence is careful and coded. Fersen served with the French army in the American Revolutionary War. When he returned to Versailles, his bond with the queen only deepened. He was one of the few people she truly trusted. As the political situation in France grew more volatile in the late 1780s, Fersen became her confidant and advisor. He watched with growing alarm as the queen's popularity vanished, and she became the target of vicious public hatred. He was her steadfast supporter when most of her other friends had either abandoned her or fled the country. After the storming of the Bastille in 1789, the royal family became prisoners in their own palace. Fersen was one of the few people who risked his life to maintain contact with them. He was determined to save them. He became the chief architect of the royal family's escape plan. For months, he meticulously planned every detail. He arranged for a specially built carriage, false passports, and relays of loyal troops along the route to the border. On the night of June 20th, 1791, he personally smuggled the king, queen, and their children out of the Tuileries Palace in Paris. He drove their carriage himself for the first part of the journey. It was an incredibly brave but desperate gamble. The escape failed. The royal family was recognized and arrested in the small town of Varennes, not far from the border. They were brought back to Paris in disgrace, surrounded by hostile crowds. The flight to Varennes was a turning point. It destroyed any remaining trust the people had in the king. It made the monarchy seem like a traitor to the nation. For Fersen, it was a devastating failure. He had come so close to saving the woman he loved, he never saw her again. From his exile in Brussels, he tried desperately to rally the European powers to intervene and save the royal family. He wrote constantly, seeking support, trying to organize another rescue attempt. He and the queen exchanged secret, coded letters. Her letters to him are filled with despair. but also with her deep affection and trust in him. His letters show his frantic, helpless anguish. In one of his last letters to her, he wrote, "I live and exist only to serve you," but there was nothing he could do. The revolution was moving too fast. In 1793, first Louis XVI and then Marie Antoinette were tried and executed. Fersen was heartbroken. His life was permanently scarred by the tragedy. He never married. He returned to Sweden and pursued a political career, but he was a changed man, haunted by the past. His own end was also violent. In 1810, during a riot in Stockholm, he was wrongly accused of being involved in the death of the Crown Prince. A furious mob dragged him from his carriage and beat him to death in the street. Their relationship was a genuine love story in a world of arranged marriages and political convenience. It was a bond that endured through years of crisis, but in the end, it was no match for the immense impersonal forces of revolution. The breakup was absolute, imposed by the guillotine. Number 7. Could a servant ever be a queen's closest confidant? After the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria sank into a profound depression. A few years later, a blunt, plain-speaking Scottish servant named John Brown entered her service. He became her closest companion, her faithful gillie. Their relationship was shockingly intimate for the time. He spoke to her with a familiarity no one else dared, calling her woman. The royal household was scandalized. Rumors, which persist to this day, suggested they were secretly married. The end of their relationship came with his sudden death, which plunged the queen into a grief almost as deep as the one she felt for Albert. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had a famously passionate marriage. When he died suddenly of typhoid in 1861, she was completely devastated. She was 42 years old. She plunged into a state of mourning that would last for the rest of her life. She withdrew from public life, wearing black every day and secluding herself in her palaces at Windsor, Osborne, and especially Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands. She was the queen of the most powerful empire in the world, but she was also a deeply lonely and grieving widow. John Brown had been a stable boy at Balmoral and a favorite outdoor servant, or gillie, of Prince Albert. In 1864, a few years after Albert's death, Victoria's doctors thought that regular exercise might help her depression. John Brown was brought down from Scotland to lead her pony. He was a rugged, powerfully built man with a thick Scottish accent and a complete lack of deference. He did not treat her like a queen. He treated her like a person. He was brutally honest, often scolding her if he thought she was being foolish. He gave her orders. He told her when she needed to put on a coat. He would even tell her to stop working. No one had ever spoken to her like that, and Victoria loved it. She came to depend on him for everything. He was her constant companion, especially at Balmoral and Osborne. She called him her best and truest friend. He was fiercely protective of her. He was also a heavy drinker and had a terrible temper, but Victoria forgave him everything. Their relationship caused a huge scandal. The other members of the royal household and the government were horrified. They saw a common uneducated servant behaving with shocking intimacy towards the Queen of England. Her own children resented him deeply. They felt he had taken their father's place in their mother's affections. The public was also aware of the relationship. Satirical pamphlets appeared, calling her Mrs. Brown. The rumors that they were secretly married were widespread. There is no conclusive evidence that they were, but the emotional intimacy was undeniable. He filled a void in her life. With him, she was not the monarch, a symbol of an empire. She was just a woman who could be looked after and even bossed around a little. He brought her out of her shell of grief and helped her re-engage with the world, even if just in a private capacity. Their relationship lasted for nearly 20 years. It ended abruptly in March 1883. John Brown caught a chill, which developed into a serious infection. He died at Windsor Castle. Victoria was inconsolable. Her grief was profound, second only to what she had felt for Albert. She wrote in her journal, "The loss is irreparable. The loneliness is dreadful. The life is gone out of the house." She commissioned statues and portraits of him. She wrote a memoir of their time together, Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, which featured him so prominently that her advisors were concerned. She wanted to write a second volume, a biography of Brown himself, but her ministers managed to talk her out of it, fearing what it might reveal. She had a portrait of him placed on his pillow in his empty room, and a fresh flower placed in it every day. She was buried, according to her instructions, with a lock of his hair, a picture of him, and his mother's wedding ring, which he had given to her. The end of their relationship was not a messy breakup in the traditional sense. It was a sudden, tragic loss. But the relationship itself was one of the most unconventional and scandalous in royal history. It was a bond that defied all social conventions, a testament to a lonely queen's need for simple, honest companionship, and the one man who was not afraid to give it to her. Number 6, can you love someone you can never marry? Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, knew each other from childhood. Theirs was the great love story of her life. For decades, he was the man she was closest to her eyes. She kept his portrait by her bedside, but she could never marry him. His wife had died under mysterious circumstances, making him a political impossibility as a husband. Their relationship was a long, complex dance of love, politics, and frustration, ending only with his death, which left her utterly heartbroken. Elizabeth and Robert Dudley grew up together. They were childhood friends, and he was one of the few people who understood the dangers and uncertainties of her early life. They were even imprisoned in the Tower of London at the same time, though in different quarters during the reign of her half-sister, Mary I. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, one of her first acts was to make Dudley her master of the horse. It was a position that gave him constant, close access to her. It was immediately clear to everyone at court that the queen was in love with him. He was handsome, charming, and ambitious. He and Elizabeth were inseparable. They flirted openly. They shared private jokes. She called him her sweet Robin. The court buzzed with speculation that she would marry him. But there was a huge problem. Robert Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived a quiet life in the country, away from the court. In 1560, Amy was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. It was a huge scandal. Dudley's enemies immediately claimed that he had arranged her death so that he would be free to marry the queen. A coroner's inquest ruled the death an accident, but the suspicion never went away. The scandal made it politically impossible for Elizabeth to marry him. Marrying a man suspected of murdering his wife would have been catastrophic for the young queen's reputation and her hold on the throne. And so began a decades-long limbo. He was the great love of her life, the man she wanted, but the one man she could not have. She kept him close as her favorite and most trusted advisor, but she would never make him her husband. This reality defined their relationship. It was filled with passion, but also with intense frustration. Dudley was a proud and ambitious man. He wanted to be king consort. He repeatedly pushed her to marry him. She repeatedly refused, or at least deferred. Their relationship was often stormy. They had terrible arguments. Elizabeth was notoriously jealous. She could not bear for him to show interest in other women, yet she would not marry him herself. Dudley, for his part, entered into secret relationships. When Elizabeth discovered in 1578 that he had secretly married her own cousin, Lettice Knollys, she was incandescent with rage. She felt utterly betrayed. She banished Lettice from court for life and temporarily exiled Dudley. She screamed at him, calling him a traitor. It seemed like the final breakup. But she could not stay away from him. Eventually, she forgave him. He was brought back into her inner circle. He remained a key figure in her government and her most trusted military commander. The romantic passion may have cooled into a deep, abiding friendship. They had been through too much together to ever be truly apart. In 1588, as the Spanish Armada approached England, it was Leicester she appointed to command her land forces. He stood beside her when she gave her famous, rousing speech to the troops at Tilbury. He died just a few weeks later. He had written her a final letter just days before his death. She received it after he was gone. She kept it in a small box by her bed for the rest of her life. On the outside, she wrote, in her own hand, his last letter. When he died, a part of Elizabeth died too. She locked herself in her rooms for days, refusing to see anyone, until Her ministers finally had to break down the door, fearing for her health. Theirs was a relationship that could never have a happy ending in the conventional sense. It was defined by what could not be. It was a love story that ended not with a breakup, but with a death that left the powerful Virgin Queen completely alone with her grief. Number 5, how do you break up with a king when you are his queen? Isabella of France was married to King Edward II of England. His blatant favoritism and possible romantic relationship with a courtier named Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer humiliated and marginalized her. After years of mistreatment, she took a lover of her own, the exiled Baron Roger Mortimer. Together they raised an army, invaded England in 1326, and overthrew her husband. She became known as the She-Wolf of France. Isabella was the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France. She was married to Edward II in 1308 as part of a political alliance. She was beautiful, intelligent, and raised in a sophisticated court. And Edward II was a handsome king, but he was not interested in his queen. His attention was entirely focused on his favorite, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a Gascon knight whom Edward had known for years. The king showered him with titles, land, and jewels. He ignored his wife and the powerful English barons in favor of Gaveston. The chroniclers of the time were shocked by the king's open affection for his favorite. They wrote that the king loved Gaveston more than his own wife, more than his own kingdom. Isabella was publicly humiliated. At her own coronation banquet, Edward spent the entire time talking and laughing with Gaveston, ignoring her completely. The tapestries were decorated with Gaveston's coat of arms alongside the king's, with no sign of the queen's. The powerful English barons were also furious. They saw Gaveston as an arrogant upstart who was poisoning the king's mind and stealing the royal patronage that should have been theirs. They forced Edward to exile Gaveston several times, but each time the king would find a way to bring him back. The conflict escalated until, in 1312, a group of barons captured Gaveston and executed him. Edward was heartbroken and furious. He never forgave the barons, and he soon found a new set of favorites, the Despencer family, father and son, both named Hugh. Hugh Despencer the Younger became even more powerful and greedy than Gaveston had been. He and his father dominated the king completely. They used their position to amass a huge fortune and to destroy their enemies. They also turned the king against Isabella. They saw her as a threat and worked to isolate her from the king and from her own children. They confiscated her lands and dismissed her household staff. Isabella was trapped. She was the Queen of England, but she was treated like a prisoner. Her chance to escape came in 1325. She was sent to France on a diplomatic mission to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, the King of France. Once she was safely in Paris, she refused to return. She declared that she would not come back to England until the Despensers were removed from power. In Paris, she found an ally. Roger Mortimer was a powerful English baron who had been one of the leaders of a rebellion against Edward and the Despensers. He had been captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, but he had made a daring escape and fled to France. He and Isabella became lovers. Together, they began to plot an invasion of England. They gathered a small army of mercenaries. In September 1326, they landed in England. They were met with immediate support. The English people and the nobility were sick of Edward and the Despensers. The king's regime collapsed with breathtaking speed. The Despensers were captured and executed in a brutal fashion. Edward II fled but was eventually captured. He was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his and Isabella's young son, Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer were now the de facto rulers of England, acting as regents for the young king. The breakup was complete. Isabella had not just left her husband, she had overthrown him. The fate of Edward II is a dark and disputed part of English history. He was imprisoned and died in Berkeley Castle in 1327, very likely murdered on the orders of Mortimer and Isabella. For a few years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England, but their reign was unpopular. Mortimer became as arrogant and greedy as the Despensers had been. In 1330, the young King Edward III, now 18, staged his own coup. He had Mortimer arrested and executed for treason. Isabella was forced into a comfortable but powerless retirement. Her dramatic, violent breakup with her husband had given her supreme power, but only for a short time. Number 4, What if your ex-boyfriend became your co-ruler? Catherine the Great and Grigori Potemkin were one of history's great power couples. They were passionate lovers, and for a time, he was the most powerful man in Russia. Their romance eventually cooled, and they took other lovers, but they never truly broke up. Instead, their relationship evolved into a unique political partnership. He remained her most trusted advisor, her co-ruler in all but name, and even helped to choose her new young lovers. Their bond transcended romance and lasted until his death. Grigori Potemkin was a striking figure. He was a tall, ambitious, and highly intelligent army officer. He was one of the men who helped Catherine seize the throne in 1762. For years, he was just one of many men at her court. But in the early 1770s, he caught the Empress's eye. He wrote her a passionate letter from the front during a war with the Ottoman Empire. She summoned him back to St. Petersburg. In 1774, they became lovers. The passion between them was immense. Their letters are filled with raw emotion, jealousy, and deep affection. He was not just a handsome young man, he was her intellectual equal. He was brilliant, eccentric, and shared her grand vision for the future of Russia. For 2 years, they were inseparable. He was made a Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, a Field Marshal, and the Vice President of the War College. He was the most powerful man in the empire. It is even possible that they were secretly married. Catherine referred to him in her letters as her husband and master, but their relationship was also volatile. They were both strong-willed and prone to dramatic moods. Their intense romantic phase burned out. By 1776, they were no longer lovers in the physical sense. This is where their story becomes truly unique. In any normal royal court, this would have been the end. The former favorite would be sent away, perhaps given a nice estate in the countryside, to make way for the new one. But Catherine and Potemkin did not break up. Instead, their relationship changed. It transformed into a deep and enduring partnership. He remained her closest friend, her most important advisor, and her partner in governing the empire. He moved out of his apartments next to hers in the Winter Palace, but he did not move out of her life. Potemkin was a man of huge talent and energy. Catherine put him in charge of her most ambitious project, the conquest and development of the newly acquired territories in the south, which were called New Russia, now southern Ukraine and Crimea. He was the viceroy of the south. He founded cities like Kherson, Nikolaev, and Sevastopol. He built the Black Sea Fleet. He was a colonial administrator on a colossal scale. He and Catherine continued to write to each other constantly, discussing everything from military strategy and foreign policy to court gossip. They also accepted each other's new romantic partners. Potemkin would often vet and even procure new young lovers for the Empress. He would select handsome young officers, groom them for the role, and present them to her. He understood her needs and wanted her to be happy. He knew that none of these young men would ever threaten his own unique position. Catherine, for her part, tolerated Potemkin's own numerous affairs. Their bond was no longer about romance. It was about power, shared ambition, and a deep, unbreakable friendship. They were a team. The famous story of the Potemkin villages, fake, portable villages built to impress Catherine during her tour of the Crimea in 1787, is likely an exaggeration invented by his enemies. But the tour itself was a real and spectacular showcase of their shared achievement. Potemkin died in 1791 in the middle of negotiating a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire. He fell ill and died on the steppe, far from the capital. When Catherine heard the news, she was utterly devastated. She wrote to a friend, "A terrible blow has struck me. My pupil, my friend, my idol is gone." She had lost her partner. Her court was never the same. Their relationship defies easy definition. It was a love affair that ended, but a partnership that never did. They managed to break up by not breaking up at all, but by redefining their relationship into something stronger and more lasting than romance alone. Number 3, was this the messiest royal marriage in Scottish history? Mary, Queen of Scots, and her second husband, Lord Darnley, had a relationship that went from infatuation to hatred in a terrifyingly short time. He was a handsome but weak, arrogant, and violent man. Consumed by jealousy and ambition, he participated in the brutal murder of Mary's private secretary, David Rizzio, in front of the pregnant queen. A year later, Darnley himself was murdered when the house he was staying in was blown up by gunpowder. The prime suspect was Mary's next husband. Mary Stuart was Queen of Scotland and, in the eyes of many Catholics, the rightful Queen of England. She was a tall, beautiful, and charismatic woman who had spent her youth at the French court. After the death of her first husband, the King of France, she returned to Scotland in 1561 to rule a turbulent and divided country. She needed a husband to provide an heir and help her govern. In 1565, she met her handsome English cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. She was instantly infatuated. He was tall, athletic, and had a royal lineage that strengthened Mary's own claim to the English throne. Despite the warnings of her advisors and the disapproval of Queen Elizabeth I of England, Mary married him just a few months after they met. It was a catastrophic mistake. The infatuation quickly wore off. Mary discovered that her new husband was immature, arrogant, and a drunkard. He was politically inept and obsessed with power. He demanded that Mary make him a king matrimonial, which would give him equal power to rule and the right to inherit the throne if she died. Mary refused. She had married him to be her consort, not her co-ruler. Darnley became resentful and paranoid. He grew intensely jealous of Mary's close relationship with her Italian private secretary, David Rizzio. Rizzio was not her lover, but he was a trusted advisor and a skilled musician who spent many hours with the queen. Darnley and a group of Protestant lords convinced themselves that Rizzio was controlling the queen and must be removed. What happened next was horrific. In March 1566, the conspirators, led by a drunken Darnley, burst into the queen's private dining room at the Palace of Holyrood House. Mary was 6 months pregnant. They dragged the screaming Rizzio from her presence and stabbed him to death some 56 times. It was a brutal act of political violence designed to terrorize the queen and show her who was really in control. Mary was held prisoner for a short time, but she used her wits to escape. She pretended to reconcile with Darnley, but her feelings for him had turned to pure hatred. She had seen his weakness, his cruelty, and his treachery. The relationship was over. Mary gave birth to a son, the future King James VI of Scotland and I of England. But the problem of what to do with Darnley remained. He was the king consort and the father of the heir. But he was also a dangerous and hated liability. He fell ill, possibly with syphilis, and was convalescing at a small house called Kirk O'Field on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Well, Mary visited him there, and it seemed a reconciliation might be possible, but it was a trap. On the night of February 10th, 1567, a massive explosion completely destroyed the house. Darnley's body, along with that of his servant, was found in the garden. He had not been killed by the blast, he had been strangled. The chief suspect in the murder plot was James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a powerful and ambitious nobleman who had become Mary's new protector and favorite. Bothwell was put on trial, but it was a sham, and he was quickly acquitted. Just a few months later, Mary married him. This was the final disaster. The Scottish lords rose up against her. They could tolerate a murdered king, but not a queen who married his murderer. And Mary was defeated in battle, forced to abdicate her throne in favor of her infant son, and imprisoned. She eventually escaped to England, seeking the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I instead. She found another prison. She would spend the next 19 years as a captive before being executed. The messy, violent breakup of her marriage to Darnley led directly to the loss of her crown, her freedom, and ultimately her life. Number 2, what if your best friend held the keys to the kingdom? Queen Anne of Great Britain and Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, had one of the most intense and politically significant female friendships in history. For over 20 years, they were inseparable. Sarah was Anne's closest confidant, her political advisor, and the manager of her finances. They used pet names, Mrs. Morley for the Queen and Mrs. Freeman for Sarah, to signify their equality in private. But Sarah's domineering personality and political disagreements eventually fractured their bond. Their final tearful meeting ended with the Queen coldly telling her, "You may put it in writing," ending a friendship that had shaped the course of British politics. Anne and Sarah met as young girls at court and formed a deep bond. Anne was shy, often in poor health, and lacked self-confidence. Sarah was beautiful, intelligent, sharp-tongued, and fiercely ambitious. She provided the strength and decisiveness that Anne lacked. When Anne became queen in 1702, Sarah's influence reached its peak. Her husband, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, was the brilliant commander of the British Army in the War of the Spanish Succession. Sarah herself was the queen's mistress of the robes and groom of the stole, powerful positions that gave her control over the royal household and, more importantly, constant access to the queen. Together, the Marlboroughs and their political ally, Sidney Godolphin, effectively ran the country for the first half of Anne's reign. Sarah used her friendship with the queen to push the agenda of the Whig Party, which strongly supported the war. Anne, who was a Tory at heart, often went along with Sarah's wishes out of affection and dependence. Their letters show the incredible intimacy of their relationship. They were more than queen and subject. They were best friends who shared everything. But the power dynamic was always complicated. Sarah was a brilliant but abrasive woman. She could be bossy and tactless. She often lectured the queen and treated her like a child. She pushed Anne too hard and too often. Cracks began to appear in the friendship. Anne grew tired of Sarah's constant hectoring and political pressure. She began to long for a friend who would be a gentle companion, not a political taskmaster. She found one in Sarah's own cousin, a poor relation whom Sarah had introduced to court, named Abigail Hill. Abigail was the opposite of Sarah. She was quiet, gentle, and deferential. She flattered the queen and listened to her problems without making demands. Secretly, a new friendship began to blossom. Abigail was also related to the leader of the Tory party, Robert Harley. He saw an opportunity. Through Abigail, he began to gain the queen's ear, turning her against the Whigs and the Marlboroughs. Sarah was horrified when she discovered she had been supplanted. She saw Abigail as a treacherous viper she had nursed in her own home. She confronted the queen, but her angry, accusatory tone only pushed Anne further away. The breakup was a slow, agonizing process that played out over several years. It was a series of bitter arguments, tearful recriminations, and long, painful silences. Sarah wrote long, pleading, and often insulting letters to the queen, trying to force her to see reason. But it was too late. Anne had found a new favorite, and she was enjoying her newfound independence from Sarah's control. The political and personal finally collided. The queen, now under the influence of Harley and Abigail, began to turn against the war and the Whig government. She was determined to be free of the Marlboroughs. The final confrontation happened in April 1710. Sarah managed to get a private audience with the queen, hoping for one last chance to repair the relationship. She begged and cried. The queen remained cold and distant, repeating the same phrase over and over. She would not answer now. Sarah could put her concerns in writing. It was a final, brutal dismissal. Sarah knew the friendship was over. Soon after, the queen dismissed Sarah from all her offices at court and later dismissed the Duke of Marlborough from his command. The Whig government fell, and the Tories came to power, ending Britain's involvement in the war. The breakup of two women's friendship had changed the political landscape of Europe. It was a deeply personal split with immense public consequences, a painful end to one of history's most powerful friendships. Number 1, can love survive? A queen's pride and a soldier's ego. Queen Elizabeth I's relationship with her final favorite, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, was a fiery and tragic clash of generations. He was young, handsome, and ambitious. She was an aging queen, 34 years his senior, who demanded absolute loyalty. Their bond was a tempestuous mix of maternal affection and romantic flirtation. But his arrogance and catastrophic failure as a military commander led to a dramatic falling out. He attempted to raise a rebellion against her, a final, desperate act that forced the queen to make a terrible choice. She signed his death warrant, sending the man she had loved to the executioner's block. Essex arrived at court in the mid-1580s. He was the stepson of Robert Dudley, the queen's great love, and he quickly captured her attention. He was everything the aging queen found attractive: tall, handsome, charming, with a flair for poetry and a soldier's courage. She was in her 50s, he was in his late teens. She doted on him, calling him her wild horse that she had to tame. He became her new favorite, filling the void left by Leicester. For a time they were inseparable. He played the part of the devoted courtier, she the adoring monarch. But their relationship was always volatile. Essex had a massive ego and a hot temper. He was not content to be a courtly favorite. He wanted real power and military glory. He was also deeply insecure and prone to fits of jealousy and sulking when he didn't get his way. Elizabeth, for her part, was an absolute monarch who would not tolerate disobedience or disrespect. She enjoyed his youthful energy, but she also needed to keep him in his place. Their arguments were legendary. In one famous incident during a heated debate, Essex turned his back on the Queen in a gesture of contempt. Elizabeth, furious, slapped him hard across the face and told him to go and be hanged. Essex, enraged, put his hand on his sword and had to be restrained by other courtiers. He shouted that he would not have taken such an insult from her father, King Henry VIII himself. The breaking point was Ireland. In 1599, Elizabeth gave Essex the one thing he had always wanted, a major military command. She sent him to Ireland as Lord Lieutenant with a huge army, the largest ever sent across the Irish Sea, to crush a major rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill. It was a complete disaster. Essex wasted his resources, failed to engage the enemy, and made a secret, unauthorized truce with the rebel leader. He had failed in his mission spectacularly and publicly. Then he made his fatal mistake. Elizabeth had expressly forbidden him to return to England without her permission. Defying her direct order, he abandoned his post, raced back to London, and in a shocking breach of all protocol, burst into the Queen's private chambers at Nonsuch Palace before she was properly dressed or had her wig on. He found her as an old woman, not as the formidable Gloriana she presented to the world. He thought his charm could save him, but he had gone too far. Elizabeth was furious at his disobedience and his failure. She placed him under house arrest. She stripped him of his offices and, crucially, his monopoly on the import of sweet wines, which was his main source of income. And Essex was ruined, disgraced, and desperate. He believed he was the victim of his enemies at court, who had poisoned the Queen's mind against him. In February 1601, he made his final insane gamble. He gathered a few hundred followers and tried to march through the city of London, hoping to raise the citizens in rebellion, capture the court, and force the Queen to dismiss his rivals. The rebellion was a pathetic failure. The people of London did not rise. Essex's small band of followers was quickly surrounded. He was arrested and charged with treason. The trial was a formality. He was found guilty. Elizabeth was faced with an agonizing decision. She had loved Essex, perhaps more as a son than a lover by that point, but he had committed the ultimate crime. He had raised a rebellion against her. For a monarch, treason could never be forgiven. She hesitated for days. There is a story that she had once given him a ring, telling him that if he was ever in trouble, he should send it to her, and she would protect him. He tried to send the ring from the tower, but it was intercepted by one of his enemies and never reached the Queen. We don't know if the story is true. What we do know is that, in the end, Elizabeth the Queen had to triumph over Elizabeth the woman. She signed the death warrant. On February 25th, 1601, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was executed at the Tower of London. The Queen was said to have been deeply depressed in the final years of her life, and many believed it was the grief and regret over Essex that finally broke her spirit. Their breakup was the most dramatic and tragic of her long reign, a final, bloody lesson that for a queen like Elizabeth, love could never, ever come before the crown.